had seen plenty of aliens during his 3 years serving aboard the Galactic Coalition cruiser Valiant Dawn. He'd shared mess halls with the Towering, their crystalline skin reflecting light like walking prisms. He'd trained alongside the fluid-bodied, who could shift their forms to fit through spaces no larger than a coin. He'd even gotten drunk once with a whose three heads argued with each other the entire night. But nothing had prepared him for. The creature stood barely 3 feet tall, if you could call what it did standing. Its body resembled a bipedal rodent crossed with something that might have crawled out of Earth's Cambrian period. Fur the color of burnt copper covered most of its body, while chitinous plates protected its chest and back. 6 eyes, arranged in 2 rows of 3, blinked independently across its elongated face. Each of its 4 arms ended in hands with 7 fingers, and had watched those fingers move with unsettling speed and precision. The first time they met was in the combat training hall, a massive space that could simulate any environment from frozen tundras to molten hellscapes. Had been running through his standard drills, working on his close-quarters combat techniques against holographic opponents. He was good, he knew that much. Top of his class at the academy, with commendations from 4 different commanding officers. He was in the middle of a complicated disarming maneuver when he heard the sound. A chittering, high-pitched noise that his translator implant struggled to process for a moment before converting it to galactic standard. Is this what human warriors look like? I expected more. Had frozen mid-strike, his practice baton hovering in the air. He turned to see perched on one of the equipment crates, all 6 eyes focused on him with what could only be described as amusement. "Excuse me," had lowered his weapon, wiping sweat from his forehead. The small alien hopped down from the crate with surprising grace, landing silently despite the metal floor. It circled slowly, tilting its head at angles that would have broken a human neck. The stories about humans spread through the coalition like wildfire. They call you apex predators from a planet so hostile that merely surviving there makes you worthy of fear. His chittering took on a mocking tone. Yet here you are, flailing about with a stick like a juvenile learning to hunt. He'd had rushed his face. He'd dealt with skepticism before. Humans were relatively new to the Galactic Coalition, having only made first contact 15 years ago. Many of the older species viewed them with suspicion, or worse, as primitives who'd somehow stumbled into spacefaring capability. But outright mockery? That was new. "I don't see you doing any better," had shot back, immediately regretting the childish response. His mandibles had spread in what would later learn was the equivalent of a smile. Challenge accepted, human. What followed had been humiliating. Despite its size, despite having 4 arms instead of 2, despite looking like something could punt across the room, had moved through the combat simulation with a fluidity that made years of training look like amateur hour. The small alien had danced between holographic attackers, its multiple limbs striking with precision that bordered on prescient. Where relied on strength and practice technique, flowed like water, never where an attack landed, always positioned perfectly for a counterstrike. When the simulation ended, hadn't even been breathing hard. Watching from the sidelines, had felt his ego crumble into dust. "Your species may be feared, human, but you individually have much to learn." Had cleaned its chitinous plates with 2 of its hands while the other 2 gestured dismissively. Perhaps the stories are exaggerated. Perhaps humans are simply lucky, stumbling through a galaxy they don't understand with more bravado than skill. That had been 3 weeks ago, and the taunting hadn't stopped. Seemed to take particular pleasure in undermining at every opportunity. During tactical briefings, the small alien would point out flaws in suggestions with cutting precision. In the mess hall would regale other crew members with stories of human incompetence, each tale slightly embellished from the last. During training exercises, would invariably find himself paired with, who treated him like a clumsy apprentice rather than a fellow warrior. The worst part was that was technically his superior officer. The small alien held the rank of Combat Specialist First Class, a position earned through hundreds of successful missions across Coalition space. Despite his 3 years of service, was still officially classified as a specialist in training. He had to follow orders, had to endure the constant stream of criticism and mockery, all while maintaining professional courtesy. His fellow humans aboard the Valiant Dawn had noticed, of course. Lieutenant Sarah, the only other human in the combat division, had pulled him aside one evening after a particularly brutal training session. "Don't let it get to you," she'd said, her dark eyes sympathetic. "Species, the owl, there from a high-gravity world in the sector. Their entire culture is built around proving dominance through combat prowess. The taunting isn't personal, it's just how they establish hierarchy. Feels pretty personal, had muttered, rubbing a bruise on his shoulder where it struck him during a sparring match. The small alien pulled its punches. He knew that much, but even a restrained hit from those chitinous arms hurt like hell. I'm not saying it doesn't suck, Sarah had continued, but has been doing this for 20 years. The alien has served in conflicts you and I only read about in history files. The siege of Terminus 7, the Wraith incursion, the Battle of the Shattered Gates, was there for all of it, came out alive when thousands didn't. That kind of experience tends to make someone a bit abrasive. Had understood intellectually. He'd read service record. It was impressive, the kind of career that inspired either admiration or terror depending on which side of the alien you stood. But understanding didn't make the daily humiliation any easier to swallow. The opportunity for redemption, or possibly further embarrassment, came on a Tuesday morning during the ship's weekly briefing. Captain, a massive whose body sparkled like a geode, had addressed the assembled crew with grave seriousness. We've received a distress call from the mining colony on Helios IV. The signal was garbled, but what we could decode indicates an attack of unknown origin. The colony's defense systems went offline approximately 6 hours ago. We're the closest coalition vessel, so Command has ordered us to investigate and render assistance. A holographic display had materialized above the briefing table, showing Helios IV rotating slowly. The planet looked unpleasant even from space, its surface a mix of rust-red deserts and jagged mountain ranges. Had pulled up the colony's information on his personal. Population, 843. Primary export, rare earth minerals used in jump drive construction. Defense rating, minimal. I'm assembling a reconnaissance team, Captain had continued. We'll send down a small unit to assess the situation before committing more resources. If it's raiders, we'll deal with them. If it's something else. The captain's crystalline features had refracted the light in a way that suggested concern. Well, we'll adapt as necessary. Had felt his heart rate pick up. He'd been on plenty of away missions before, but most had been routine. Diplomatic escorts, cargo transfers, the occasional search and rescue operation. An actual combat scenario. This would be his first. Combat specialist will lead the ground team, the captain had announced, and had seen the small alien straighten with pride. You'll take specialists and lieutenant will pilot the dropship. You'll have full tactical authority once on the ground. Had caught gaze across the briefing room. All 6 of the alien's eyes had focused on him, and that mandible smile had spread across its face. The message was clear, more opportunities to showcase human inadequacy. The next 2 hours had been a blur of preparation. Had checked and rechecked his gear. Standard coalition combat armor adapted for human physiology, a pulse rifle with enough charge packs to level a small building, a sidearm for close quarters work, medical supplies, scanning equipment, and enough rations to last a week if things went sideways. He'd met the rest of the team in the hangar bay. His gelatinous body contained within a specialized environmental suit that allowed him to maintain form in various atmospheres. Was something had never encountered before, a shriek from the Outer Rim territories. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with skin like volcanic glass and 3 jointed legs that made her movements seem alien even by coalition standards. Both were experienced combat specialists. Both had served with before, and both regarded with the kind of polite indifference reserved for rookies. Had inspected each team member with military precision, checking weapons, armor seals, and equipment loadouts. When the small alien reached, the inspection took noticeably longer. Your armor seal on the left shoulder is 0.3 millimeters out of alignment, had chittered. In a hostile environment, that could mean the difference between life and death. It's within acceptable parameters, had countered, his jaw tight. Acceptable for humans, perhaps, but we maintain higher standards on my team. Had reached up and, despite the height difference, had adjusted his armor with those quick, precise fingers. There, now you might survive long enough to actually be useful. The flight down to Helios IV had been tense. Lieutenant had piloted the dropship with her usual skill, but even she couldn't smooth out the turbulence as they hit the planet's atmosphere. The ship had bucked and shuddered, and had gripped his harness straps, trying to ignore the way his stomach attempted to relocate to his throat. Naturally had remained perfectly calm, all 6 eyes scanning through the tactical readouts on the ship's displays. Sensor scans are showing minimal energy signatures at the colony site. Either the attack knocked out most of their systems, or whatever hit them is using stealth technology. What about life signs? Had asked, her voice a resonant bass that vibrated through his chest. Difficult to tell from orbit. Too much interference from the mineral deposits in the area. We'll need to get closer. Had looked at each team member in turn. Standard reconnaissance protocol. We land at the extraction point 5 kilometers from the colony, approach on foot, assess the situation, and report back. If we encounter hostiles, we engage only if necessary to complete the mission or ensure our survival. Understood. Everyone had nodded, had felt his mouth go dry. This was it, his first real test in actual combat conditions. Everything he'd trained for, everything he'd worked toward, it all came down to the next few hours. The dropship had set down on a rocky plateau overlooking a vast desert basin. The colony was visible in the distance, a cluster of prefabricated buildings and mining equipment huddled against a cliff face. From this distance, everything looked intact, but armor sensors were picking up something wrong. The power signatures were all off, and there was a strange electromagnetic pulse emanating from the colony center. Move out, had ordered, and the team had deployed from the ship in practiced formation. The moment's boots hit the rust-red soil of Helios IV, he'd felt the weight of the planet's gravity. It was slightly higher than Earth standard, enough to notice but not enough to seriously impair movement. The air was thin but breathable, the sky a sickly orange color that made everything look diseased. They'd moved toward the colony in tactical formation, with on point, and on the flanks, and in the center where the small alien could direct the team's movements. The terrain was treacherous, all loose rocks and hidden crevasses that could turn an ankle or worse if you weren't careful. As they drew closer to the colony, the signs of violence became apparent. Scorch marks on the buildings, debris scattered across what had been the main courtyard, equipment that looked like it had been torn apart rather than simply damaged, and everywhere an eerie silence that made skin crawl. Spread out, had commanded. Search for survivors, stay in communication range, report anything unusual immediately. Had moved toward the nearest building, a structure that is identified as one of the residential blocks. The door had been blown inward, hanging from one hinge. He'd entered carefully, pulse rifle raised, every nerve ending on high alert. Inside, the building was a disaster. Furniture overturned, personal belongings scattered everywhere, signs of a hasty evacuation or a violent struggle. Had cleared each room methodically, the way he'd been trained, but found no bodies, no blood, no signs of what had happened to the colonists. Report, his voice had crackled through his comm unit. Residential Block 3 is clear. No survivors, no casualties. It's like everyone just vanished. Same here, had chimed in. My sector shows signs of combat but no actual combatants. They'd continued the search for another 30 minutes, finding more of the same. Evidence of an attack, evidence of resistance, but no attackers and no defenders. Just empty buildings and the howling wind that swept across the desert. Had never heard a shriek scream before. The sound was like metal tearing, like glass breaking, like every wrong noise in the universe compressed into a single moment of pure terror. His training kicked in immediately, and he was sprinting towards last known position before his conscious mind even registered the command. He found her in what appeared to be the colony's main storage facility, a massive warehouse filled with mining equipment and supply crates. Was backing away from something, her 3 legs moving in an awkward scramble that spoke of genuine fear. Skidded to a halt beside her, his rifle raised, and finally saw what had caused her distress. At first, his brain couldn't process what he was looking at. It seemed to be made of shadow and smoke, a vaguely humanoid shape that flickered in and out of visual existence. Where it moved, the air itself seemed to distort, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The thing was crouched over something on the ground, and as his eyes adjusted, he realized with horror that it was feeding on one of the colonists. The body on the ground was shriveled, desiccated, like every drop of moisture had been extracted from it. The creature feeding on it pulsed with a sickly luminescence, growing more solid, more real with each passing second. Contact, had shouted into his comm even as he opened fire. The pulse rifle's energy bolts passed through the creature like it wasn't even there. The thing's head, if it could be called that, swiveled toward with interest. Where eyes should have been, there were only empty voids that seemed to absorb light itself. Then it moved. Had considered himself fast. He'd scored in the top percentile on every reflex test the Academy had given him. But this creature moved like thought, like it existed in multiple places at once. One moment it was crouched over its victim, the next it was in front of him, one shadowy appendage raised to strike. Its massive arm had swept aside, probably saving his life. The creature's attack missed him by inches, but where its limb passed through the air could feel cold. Not physical cold, but something deeper, something that reached into his chest and tried to freeze the warmth out of his bones. "Fall back," his voice had commanded, and the team had retreated from the warehouse in a fighting withdrawal. More of the shadow creatures had emerged from the darkness, drawn by the commotion. They moved with that same impossible speed, that same flickering presence that made them hard to target, harder to hit. The team had made it back to the colony's courtyard, forming a defensive circle with their backs to a large cargo transport. Hart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his armor. He'd reloaded his rifle twice, fired what felt like 100 shots, and hadn't hit a single one of the things. "Standard weapons aren't effective," had reported, his gelatinous form rippling with stress inside his containment suit. "The energy passes through them like they're not made of matter." "They're made of matter," had countered, the small alien's voice remarkably calm despite the circumstances. "Just not in a phase state we're equipped to handle. Thermal scanners show cold spots where they should be warm. They're absorbing energy, probably what they were doing to the colonists." Another wave of creatures had emerged from the buildings, at least a dozen of them now. They moved in an unsettling synchronization, like parts of a single organism rather than individual entities. Had found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with, the towering shriek's presence oddly comforting even as his own terror threatened to overwhelm him. "Specialist," had called out, and had torn his eyes away from the approaching horrors. "Your species evolved on a yes." "That's what they say," had managed, not sure where this was going. "High gravity, violent weather patterns, aggressive megafauna, deadly microorganisms." Had been adjusting something on one of its weapons, those multiple hands working with frantic speed. "Tell me, what kills things on your world when energy weapons are unavailable?" His mind had raced. What did kill things on Earth? What had humanity used before pulse rifles and plasma cannons? "Kinetic force," he'd said slowly. "Physical impact, we hit things until they stop moving." His mandibles had spread in that predatory smile. "Exactly. These creatures exist partially in our phase state and partially in another. Energy weapons pass through the parts that aren't fully here, but physical matter." The small alien had holstered its pulse rifle and drawn a wicked-looking blade from its back harness. "Physical matter should interact with the parts that are." "You want us to fight those things in melee?" had sounded incredulous. "Combat specialist with respect, that's suicide." "It's also our only option," had looked at each team member in turn. "We have approximately 15 seconds before they're on us. I need to know if you trust me." Had surprised himself by answering immediately, "Yes." The other team members had echoed his sentiment, even if they didn't sound entirely convinced. Had nodded once sharply, and then the creatures had been upon them. What followed was the most terrifying 30 seconds of his life. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang from its sling, and drawn his combat knife. The blade was standard issue, hardened steel with a monomolecular edge, designed more for utility than combat. But when the first shadow creature had lunged at him, and he'd swung the blade in a desperate arc, it had connected. The creature had recoiled, a portion of its shadowy form dissipating where the blade had passed through. It wasn't dead, wasn't even seriously injured, but it had felt the hit. That knowledge, that confirmation that they could fight back, had given the courage he needed. The battle had devolved into chaos, had fought with a desperation he'd never experienced in training, all technique abandoned in favor of pure survival instinct. He'd slashed and stabbed, ducked and weaved, his body moving on autopilot while his mind screamed in terror. The creatures were fast, but they were also cautious now, wary of the physical weapons that could actually harm them. Through the chaos, had caught glimpses of his teammates. Fought like a titan, her volcanic glass skin apparently resistant to the creature's energy-draining touch, her massive fists pulverizing any shadow that came too close. Had shifted his gelatinous form into dozens of thin, sharp tendrils, each one capable of piercing through the creature's incorporeal defenses. And was magnificent. The small alien moved through the battle like a whirlwind of death, 4 arms wielding 4 different blades, each one singing through the air with lethal precision. where fought with desperate strength and with overwhelming power, fought with art. Every movement was calculated, every strike placed exactly where it needed to be for maximum effect. The shadow creatures fell before the small alien like wheat before a scythe. Had been so focused on his own survival that he'd almost missed the new threat. One of the creatures, larger than the others, had emerged from the main mining facility. It moved with more purpose, more intelligence than its companions, and it was heading straight for. "Behind you," had shouted, but his warning came too late. The large creature had struck with a glancing blow, and the small alien had gone flying, crashing into a cargo container with sickening force. Without thinking, without planning, had charged. His knife was in his hand, his teeth were bared in a snarl that would have done his primate ancestors proud, and every instinct that had kept humanity alive on Earth's hostile surface had roared to life in his brain. The creature had turned toward him, those empty void eyes focusing on this new threat. Had learned later that what happened next was captured by his armor's recording system. The footage would be analyzed by and combat specialists throughout Coalition space, becoming required viewing for anyone dealing with phase-shifted entities. But in the moment, had been aware of nothing but the enemy in front of him and the teammate behind him who needed help. He'd feinted left, then rolled right, coming up inside the creature's guard. His knife had found purchase in what might have been the thing's torso, and he'd felt resistance, felt the blade catch on something solid within the shadow. Then he'd twisted, ripped, torn with all the savage efficiency that 3 billion years of predatory evolution had bred into the human species. The creature had shrieked, a sound that wasn't really sound at all but something that registered directly in its mind as pure anguish. It had tried to pull away, but it held on, his free hand gripping what felt like frozen smoke, his entire body screaming at him to let go while his mind refused to obey. He'd stabbed again, and again, and again, until the creature's form had destabilized and collapsed into wisps of dark vapor that dissipated in the alien wind. The remaining creatures had retreated immediately, vanishing back into the buildings they'd emerged from. The sudden silence had been almost worse than the battle, broken only by ragged breathing and the sound of his blood pounding in his ears. He'd stood there, knife still raised, his entire body shaking with adrenaline until his hand had gently lowered his arm. "It's over, specialist," they fled. Had turned to check on, fear clutching at his chest. The small alien had been pulling itself upright, two hands checking for injuries while the other two retrieved the blades that had scattered during the impact. When those 6 eyes had focused on, there had been something different in them. Not mockery, not dismissal. "Respect. Adequate work, human," had chittered, and even through the translator's flat rendering had heard the approval. "Your species' reputation may not be entirely unearned." They'd regrouped quickly after that, establishing a defensive perimeter while contacted the Valiant Dawn for extraction and reinforcements. The shadow creatures didn't attack again, but sensor readings showed them still present in the colony, presumably feeding on whatever colonists they'd already captured. "We need to get back to the dropship," had urged. "We're not equipped for this kind of engagement." "Agreed," had said, but those 6 eyes had been scanning the colony buildings with obvious frustration. "But there may still be survivors. If we leave now, we condemn anyone still alive to the same fate as the colonist we found." Had checked his equipment. His knife was intact but covered in a strange residue that his scanner couldn't identify. His pulse rifle was useless against these enemies. His armor had held up well, but he could feel bruises forming where the creatures had struck him. By all rights, they should have been calling for backup and waiting for a properly equipped force to handle the situation. Instead, he'd found himself saying, "We should search the residential sectors one more time. These things seem to prefer feeding in isolated locations. If there are survivors, they'd be hiding in the smaller buildings." The other team members had stared at him, even had seemed surprised by the suggestion. "That would require splitting up," the small alien had pointed out. "Tactically unsound given the opposition we're facing." "Then we move fast and stay in communication," had surprised himself with how steady his voice sounded. "We've got maybe an hour before the sun sets. These things seem stronger in darkness. If we're going to find anyone alive, we need to do it now." There had been a long moment of silence, then had nodded slowly. "Teams of 2, and you take the eastern residential blocks, and I will clear the western sectors. Maintain constant communication. If you encounter more than 3 hostiles, you retreat immediately. Understood." They'd understood. And as had moved through the abandoned colony with at his side, searching for survivors among the ruins, he'd felt something shift in their dynamic. They weren't quite partners, not yet. But they weren't adversary and victim anymore either. They'd found 6 survivors huddled in a reinforced storage room, a mix of human and alien colonists who'd barricaded themselves inside when the attack began. The relief on their faces when, and had cut through the door, had been palpable. Getting them back to the extraction point had been tense, with shadow creatures stalking them from the darkness, but never quite attacking, until reinforcements from the Valiant Dawn had arrived with proper phase disruption weapons. The debriefing lasted 4 hours, and by the end of it, felt like he'd fought the battle all over again. Captain had been thorough, questioning every decision, every tactical choice, every moment of the encounter with the shadow creatures. The combat footage from their armor systems had been analyzed frame by frame, with tactical experts weighing in through secure communication channels. "These entities are unlike anything in our database," one of the scientists had explained, her image flickering on the holographic display. She was her translucent form containing what looked like small galaxies of bioluminescence. "The preliminary analysis suggests they exist partially in normal space and partially in what we're calling shadow space, a dimension that overlaps with ours but operates under different physical laws. They feed on bioelectric energy, draining life force from organic beings." "How did they get to Helios IV?" Lieutenant had asked, her arms crossed as she stood beside. "That colony's been there for 12 years. Why attack now?" "Unknown," the scientist had admitted. "But the mining operations there have been expanding into deeper geological layers. It's possible they disturbed something, opened a passage between dimensions that these creatures used to cross over." Captain had turned his crystalline gaze on the reconnaissance team. "Your quick thinking saved lives today. 6 colonists who would otherwise be dead are receiving medical treatment in our infirmary. The survivors report that these creatures appeared approximately 8 hours before our arrival, emerging from the primary mining shaft and spreading throughout the colony with terrifying speed." "What's being done about the remaining creatures?" had asked, all 6 eyes focused intently on the captain. "A specialized containment team is being dispatched from Coalition Command. They'll arrive within 36 hours with equipment designed to seal the dimensional breach and eliminate or capture any remaining entities." The captain had paused, his crystalline form refracting the dim lighting of the briefing room. "Until then, we maintain a perimeter around the colony. No one goes down, nothing comes up." The debriefing had concluded shortly after that, with commendations promised for the entire team. Had felt exhausted, drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He'd seen combat, real combat, and the reality of it was nothing like the simulations he'd trained with. People died in combat. Colonists who'd woken up that morning expecting another routine day of mining operations had been reduced to dried husks by creatures from a dimension they'd never even known existed. He'd been heading toward his quarters, thinking about nothing more complicated than a hot shower and 8 hours of unconsciousness, when had intercepted him in the corridor. "Walk with me, specialist," the small alien had said, and something in the tone made think it wasn't really a request. They'd walked in silence through the ship's corridors, past crew members heading to and from their duty stations, past observation windows showing the rust-red sphere of Helios IV rotating slowly below them. Eventually, had led him to one of the ship's observation lounges, a small room with transparent walls offering a panoramic view of space. "Sit," had commanded, hopping onto one of the benches designed for larger species. Had settling onto the seat beside the small alien, feeling like a child called to the principal's office. For a long moment, had simply stared out at the stars, all 6 eyes blinking in a pattern couldn't decipher. Then the alien had spoken, its voice quieter than had ever heard it. "I owe you an apology, specialist." Had blinked in surprise, "Sir." "Don't interrupt," had chittered, though without the usual mocking edge. "I have been unfair in my assessment of you and cruel in my methods of training. This is something I need to acknowledge." "I don't understand," had said honestly. His mandibles had clicked together in a gesture, was beginning to recognize as the alien equivalent of a sigh. "My species values strength above all else. In our culture, weakness is not tolerated, is not even acknowledged. We push each other constantly, testing for flaws, for breaking points, because we believe that only through such testing can true strength emerge." "That's one approach," had said carefully, not sure where this was going. It is the wrong approach for humans, had continued. I see that now. Your species doesn't grow stronger through constant pressure and mockery. You grow stronger through adversity faced together, through challenges overcome as a unit rather than as individuals constantly competing. The small alien had turned all 6 eyes on, and in them had seen something he'd never expected to see: regret. When that creature struck me, my first thought was that I had failed my team, that my arrogance and my need to dominate had put everyone at risk. Then you charged that creature alone against an enemy you couldn't possibly defeat, and I understood. Understood what? Had asked quietly. Why humans are feared, had said simply. Not because you're strong, many species are strong, not because you're clever, many species are clever. You're feared because when one of you is threatened, the rest of you become something other. Something that doesn't calculate odds or consider consequences. Something that simply refuses to let a fall. Had thought about that, about the moment he'd charged the large shadow creature without hesitation, without plan, driven by nothing more than the sight of a teammate in danger. We call it having each other's backs, he'd said. It's what makes us human. It's what makes you dangerous, had corrected, but there had been approval in the alien's voice. The stories about humans, the ones that spread through the coalition, they're not about individual humans. They're about what humans become when they fight together. When you form what you call a team, you become something greater than the sum of your parts. I have fought alongside dozens of species, specialists. I have never seen this quality in any of them the way I see it in humans. There had been a comfortable silence after that, both of them watching the stars wheel slowly past the observation window. Finally had spoken up. For what it's worth, sir, you were right about a lot of things. I was sloppy in training. I relied too much on strength and not enough on technique. I needed someone to push me to be better. Perhaps, had acknowledged. But there's a difference between pushing someone to improve and tearing them down to feed your own ego. I was doing the latter, justified by my species' traditions, when I should have been doing the former. They'd sat together for a while longer before had hopped down from the bench. Get some rest, specialist. Tomorrow we begin training again, but this time as comrades rather than adversary and victim. Looking forward to it, sir, had said and meant it. The next few days had fallen into a new rhythm. Still critiqued combat techniques, still pointed out flaws and areas for improvement, but the mockery was gone. In its place was genuine instruction, the kind that came from a warrior with decades of experience sharing knowledge with someone eager to learn. Had found himself improving rapidly, his movements becoming sharper, his tactical thinking more refined. More importantly, he'd found himself understanding better. The small alien's culture might value individual strength, but had learned to appreciate the human approach to combat. During training sessions, the alien would often pause to explain not just what should do, but why, connecting techniques to tactical situations, building understanding rather than simply demanding compliance. The other crew members had noticed the change too. Lieutenant had cornered in the mess hall one evening, her dark eyes dancing with amusement. So, what happened between you and... The little terror has been positively pleasant lately. We came to an understanding, had said, spearing a piece of something that was supposed to approximate chicken but tasted like plastic. Turns out almost dying together is good for building mutual respect. That's the human way, Sarah had agreed, laughing. Nothing brings people together like shared trauma. The specialized containment team had arrived from Coalition Command on schedule, a group of scientists and soldiers equipped with technology that made the Valiant Dawn's weapons look primitive by comparison. They'd sealed the dimensional breach on Helios IV, captured or eliminated the shadow creatures, and declared the colony safe for eventual. The 6 survivors had been transferred to a medical frigate for more comprehensive treatment, and the Valiant Dawn had been cleared to resume its patrol route. 3 weeks later, found himself in the training hall again, but this time he wasn't alone. Had implemented a new training protocol, one that involved mixed species teams working together to solve combat scenarios. Was partnered with a young named or whose crystalline body refracted light in distracting patterns, and a technician named Rill who specialized in infiltration operations. The scenario was simple in concept, complex in execution. Infiltrate a hostile facility, retrieve a high-value target, and escape without raising alarms. Standard extraction operation, the kind that happened dozens of times throughout Coalition space every month. Remember, had instructed, watching from the observation platform above the training hall, this isn't about individual capability. It's about team coordination. Use each other's strengths. Cover each other's weaknesses. Think as one unit, not three separate operators. The simulation had begun and had found himself falling into the rhythm he'd been developing. Or's crystalline form could create holographic projections, perfect for distractions. Rill could compress his gelatinous body to infiltrate spaces no one else could reach. And well, had his human adaptability, his ability to improvise and adjust plans on the fly. They'd made it through the first two stages of the simulation smoothly, but the third stage had thrown them a curveball. The high-value target was being held in a chamber that required three simultaneous actions to access: a biometric scan, a code input, and a physical key turned at precisely the same moment. The simulation was designed to be nearly impossible, forcing teams to either give up or make critical errors. Had studied the problem for 30 seconds, his mind racing through possibilities. Then he'd looked at his teammates and smiled. "I've got an idea, but it's going to require perfect timing." What they'd done next had made chittering with what had learned to recognize as laughter. Using Or's holographic projection to fool the biometric scanner, Rill's flexible form to reach the code input panel while simultaneously wrapping around the physical key, and his own steady hands to coordinate the timing. They'd synchronized all three actions with barely a millisecond of error. The door had opened, they'd retrieved the target, and escaped with time to spare. When the simulation ended and the team emerged from the training hall had been waiting for them, all six eyes bright with approval. "Excellent work. That scenario has a failure rate of 92% among coalition teams. You're only the 8th group to solve it in the past 5 years." Had the idea, Or had said, his crystalline voice chiming like bells. "We just executed it." "But I couldn't have done it without you too," had countered. "That's kind of the point, right? None of us could have succeeded alone." Had nodded slowly. "You're learning, specialist, finally learning what it means to be part of something larger than yourself." That evening had been summoned to Captain's ready room. The captain's quarters were impressive, decorated with crystalline art from colonies throughout the coalition and featuring a desk made from compressed starship hull plating. The captain himself had been reviewing holographic reports when entered. "Specialist, thank you for coming," the captain had said, gesturing for to sit. "I wanted to speak with you about your career progression." Had sat, feeling nervous excitement building in his chest. "Sir, Combat Specialist has submitted a formal commendation for your actions on Helios IV. Additionally, the alien has requested that you be assigned as a permanent member of the Rapid Response Team." The captain's crystalline features had shifted in what had learned to interpret as a smile. "This is high praise coming from. The alien rarely requests specific team members and has never done so for someone with as little experience as you have." "I'm honored, sir," had managed, his mind still processing the information. "There's more," Captain had continued. "Coalition Command has been reviewing the combat footage from your encounter with the shadow creatures. Your tactics, specifically the decision to engage in close combat when ranged weapons proved ineffective, has become required study material for combat specialists throughout the fleet. You become something of a minor celebrity, specialist." Had felt his face flush. "I was just trying to survive, sir." "The best tactical innovations often come from desperation," the captain had observed. "But that's not why I called you here. I wanted to inform you personally that you're being promoted." Effective immediately, the promotion had come with a new insignia for his armor, a slight increase in pay grade, and most importantly, official assignment to the Valiant Dawn's Rapid Response Team. Wore the rank with pride, though he was careful not to let it go to his head. He'd seen too many young soldiers get cocky after their first taste of success, only to make fatal mistakes later when they thought they were invincible. Seemed pleased with the promotion, in the alien's own way. The small creature had started including in tactical planning sessions, asking for his input on mission parameters and team compositions. It was a far cry from their first encounter in the training hall and appreciated the trust implicit in that inclusion. 2 months after the Helios IV incident, the Valiant Dawn received new orders. A coalition diplomatic vessel had gone silent while negotiating with the Thresh, a reclusive species from the Galactic Rim who'd only recently opened communications with the wider community. The last transmission from the diplomatic ship indicated some kind of emergency, but the details were garbled and incomplete. "The Thresh are difficult," Captain had explained during the mission briefing. They communicate primarily through pheromones and physical displays that our translators struggle to interpret. Their society is structured around complex hierarchies that shift based on factors we don't fully understand. The diplomatic team was making progress, or so we thought, but now we have silence. A holographic display had shown the last known position of the diplomatic vessel, a region of space near a Thresh colony world called. The area was marked with warning indicators, coalition code for territories where standard protocols might not apply. "We'll approach carefully," the captain had continued. "The Thresh have given us permission to enter their space to search for the missing ship, but that permission is tenuous. Any sign of aggression, any misunderstanding, could turn this from a rescue operation into a diplomatic incident that sets back human-Thresh relations by decades." Had studied the information on his. The Thresh were larger than humans, roughly 9 feet tall when fully extended, with segmented bodies covered in chitinous plates. They possessed 6 limbs that could function as either arms or legs depending on need, and their faces were dominated by compound eyes and mandibles that could crush steel. To human eyes, they looked like a cross between a centipede and a mantis, and had to consciously suppress the instinctive unease that their appearance triggered. "The Rapid Response Team will lead the search," Captain had announced. "Combat Specialist, you'll have tactical command. Take and plus diplomatic liaison from the Cultural Affairs Division. Locate the missing ship, determine what happened, and extract any survivors if possible." Diplomatic liaison was a human, which surprised. The woman was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of calm demeanor that came from years of dealing with alien cultures. She'd introduced herself to the team with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. "I know what you're thinking," she'd said, looking at each team member in turn. "You're combat specialists, I'm a diplomat. We speak different languages, but the Thresh respect strength demonstrated through restraint. If we find the diplomatic vessel in Thresh space, how we conduct ourselves will matter more than anything we might say." The journey to Thresh space took 3 days at maximum cruise speed. During that time, had conducted briefings on Thresh culture, their social structures, their communication methods, and most importantly, their taboos and triggers. Had absorbed the information like a sponge, recognizing that on this mission, knowledge could be more valuable than weapons. "The Thresh have a concept they call," had explained. "It roughly translates to appropriate force. In their culture, using more force than a situation requires is seen as weakness, a failure to properly assess threats and respond proportionally. Conversely, using too little force is also seen as weakness, an inability to properly defend oneself." "How are we supposed to know what's appropriate?" had asked, his gelatinous form rippling with concern. "Experience and instinct," had replied. "The Thresh believe that truly strong beings can sense the correct level of force intuitively. It's part of why they've struggled with coalition integration. Most species rely on explicit rules and guidelines. The Thresh expect you to simply know." "Wonderful," had muttered. "No pressure then." When they'd finally entered Thresh space, the differences from standard coalition territory were immediately apparent. The navigation beacons used different frequencies. The security protocols required multiple confirmations in formats that were barely compatible with coalition systems, and the space traffic patterns followed logic that seemed deliberately obtuse. "They're testing us," had observed, watching the sensor readouts with all 6 eyes. "Every interaction is an evaluation. They want to see if we can navigate their systems without asking for help." It had taken 6 hours of careful maneuvering, but they'd finally located the missing diplomatic vessel. The ship was in orbit around, its systems powered down but otherwise intact. No distress signals, no signs of battle damage, just silence. "That's not good," Lieutenant had said from the pilot's seat of their shuttle. "If the ship was attacked or disabled, we'd see evidence. This looks like they shut down voluntarily." "Or were forced to shut down," had rumbled, her volcanic glass skin reflecting the light of the alien sun in unsettling patterns. They docked with the diplomatic vessel carefully, following protocols designed to prevent accidental damage or contamination. The airlock had cycled normally, and when they'd entered the ship, everything had appeared normal. Too normal. The corridors were clean, the lights were on emergency power, and there was no sign of struggle or violence. "Spread out," had ordered. "Teams of 2, you're with me. Stay close to, check the engineering sections, report anything unusual." Had followed through the ship's corridors, his pulse rifle held in a ready position despite the apparent lack of threats. The diplomatic vessel was smaller than the Valiant Dawn, designed more for comfort and impressive appearances than combat capability. The walls were decorated with artwork from various coalition species, a visual representation of unity and cooperation. They'd found the crew in the main conference room, and the site had stopped cold. 12 beings, a mix of humans and aliens, were arranged in perfect rows like students in a classroom. They sat unnaturally still, their eyes open but unfocused, their breathing shallow but regular. It was like walking into a room full of mannequins, except these mannequins were alive. "Medical emergency," had reported through the comm. "All hands to the conference room. We need immediate assistance." And had arrived first, the diplomatic liaison immediately moving to check on the nearest crew member. "They're alive," she'd confirmed, her fingers checking pulse points and pupil responses. "But they're in some kind of catatonic state. It's like their minds are somewhere else." "Look at the center of the room," had said, his gelatinous form quivering as he pointed with a tendril. In the exact center of the conference room, someone had arranged a complex pattern using what looked like pieces of colored glass. The pattern was geometric, precise, and completely at odds with the rest of the room's decor. Had approached it carefully, his scanner analyzing the composition. "It's a Thresh communication device," had said, her voice tight with recognition. "A neural broadcaster. They use it for complex negotiations where words aren't sufficient. It projects thoughts and emotions directly into the minds of those nearby." "And these people got caught in the broadcast?" had asked, looking at the catatonic crew members with new horror. "Possibly," had said. "Or they were using it to communicate with the Thresh and something went wrong. Either way, we need to shut it down and get them medical attention immediately." Before anyone could move toward the device, the ship had shuddered. Not violently, but with a deliberate force that suggested something large had just attached itself to the hull. Had raised his rifle, his heart rate spiking as his combat training kicked in. "We have company," Lieutenant's voice had crackled through the comm. "3 Thresh vessels just appeared on sensors. They're moving to surround us." "Do not engage," had ordered immediately. "This is their space, their rules. We wait and see what they want." What they wanted became clear about 30 seconds later when a section of the conference room wall had simply opened. Not a door, not an airlock, just a section of hull that folded away to reveal a boarding tunnel that definitely hadn't been there a moment ago. Through the tunnel came the Thresh. Had seen images of them, had studied their physiology and behavior patterns, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of their presence. The lead Thresh was massive, easily 10 feet tall, when it extended its segmented body to its full height. Its compound eyes caught the light and reflected it in 1,000 different directions, and its mandibles moved in patterns that translator implants struggled to interpret. "This one greets you," the Thresh had said through the translator, its voice a clicking, buzzing sound that sets teeth on edge. "This one is called Nor, guardian of the 5th hierarchy of the colony world below. This one observes that you have found the sleeping ones." "We did," had stepped forward, her body language carefully neutral. "We came seeking our lost companions. We mean no disrespect to your territory or your people." Nor had tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped a human spine, studying with those multifaceted eyes. "This one understands. This one must evaluate whether you possess, whether you are worthy of the knowledge the sleeping ones received." "We accept your evaluation," had said carefully, and had seen tense slightly. This was it, the moment where their mission could succeed or fail based on how they responded to whatever test the Thresh had in mind. "This one will present a challenge," Nor had continued. "You will face one of our warrior priests in single combat. Victory proves, defeat proves you are not ready for the knowledge. Death," the Thresh had paused, its mandibles spreading in what might have been a smile. "Death proves you were never worthy to begin with." It felt ice water run through his veins. Single combat against a Thresh warrior priest. The files had been clear about how dangerous Thresh warriors were. They'd evolved as apex predators on a high-gravity world where everything was trying to kill everything else. Their reflexes were faster than most species could track. Their strength was sufficient to tear through standard combat armor, and they fought with a religious fervor that made them nearly impossible to intimidate. "I'll do it," had heard himself say, and had immediately wondered if he'd suffered some kind of brain injury during the mission to Helios IV. Everyone had turned to stare at him. 6 eyes had widened in surprise, had looked like she wanted to object but wasn't sure how. Even Nor had seemed taken aback, its segmented body shifting in what might have been curiosity. "You," the Thresh had clicked. "You are young, you are small, why would you volunteer for this?" "Because someone has to," had said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "And because I'm probably the most expendable member of the team. No offense to anyone else, but if someone's going to die here, better me than our diplomatic liaison or our commanding officer." "Stand down," had ordered, but there had been uncertainty in the small alien's voice. "This isn't a decision you make lightly." "I'm not making it lightly," had countered. "I'm making it because it's the right call. The Thresh want to see appropriate force. What's more appropriate than putting forward your least experienced warrior? It shows confidence without arrogance. It demonstrates that we trust in our training and our team, not just in our most powerful individuals." Nor had moved closer to, looming over him in a way that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "This one sees wisdom in your reasoning, small human. This one will accept your challenge. We will fight in the traditional way on the sacred grounds below. If you survive 20 heartbeats, you pass the test. If you defeat the warrior priest, you prove humanity worthy of alliance. If you die—" The Thresh had paused again. "If you die, this one will ensure your name is remembered in our histories as one who possessed courage if not." 20 heartbeats, had repeated, his mind already racing through the implications. Not defeat, not victory, just survival. That was achievable, maybe. "I accept your terms." The rest of the team had been transported down to along with the catatonic diplomatic crew. The planet's surface was harsh, all sharp rocks and thin atmosphere, but the Thresh had led them to what they called the sacred grounds, an arena carved into the side of a mountain where generations of warriors had tested themselves. The sacred grounds were exactly what it expected, and nothing like what he'd imagined. The arena was circular, about 50 meters in diameter, with walls of smooth stone that bore the scars of countless battles. The floor was packed dirt mixed with something that looked like crushed bone, and the whole place smelled of ozone and dried blood. Thresh observers lined the walls, their segmented bodies arranged in complex patterns that translator couldn't begin to decode. Stood in the center of the arena, stripped of his armor and weapons per the rules of engagement. He wore only the thin bodysuit that went under his combat gear, and even that felt like too much protection given the circumstances. Across from him, separated by 20 meters of open ground, stood the warrior priest. The Thresh warrior made Nor look small. It was at least 12 feet tall, its chitinous plates and pitted from decades of combat. Its compound eyes were a deeper color than those of the other Thresh, almost black, and its mandibles were decorated with what looked like precious metals woven into the natural structure. It held a weapon that resembled a staff with bladed ends, each blade curved and serrated in ways that made stomach clench. "This one is honored to test the human," the warrior priest had said through translator. "This one will not hold back. This one will not show mercy. This is the way of—" "Understood," had managed, his mouth dry despite the moisture recyclers in his bodysuit. 20 heartbeats. All he had to do was survive 20 heartbeats against a creature that could tear him apart without breaking a sweat. Had pulled him aside for a final moment before the combat began. The small alien's 6 eyes had been full of concern, an emotion had never seen there before. "You don't have to do this. We can find another way." "There is no other way," had replied quietly. "You know that as well as I do. The Thresh don't operate on coalition logic. They need to see proof of worth, and this is how they measure it." "Then listen carefully," had said, all 4 hands gripping his arms with surprising strength. "The warrior priest will be faster than you, stronger than you, and more experienced than you. You cannot win through direct confrontation. You must think like a human, use what your species does best." "And what's that?" had asked, genuinely curious about what would say. "You endure," the small alien had said simply. "When every other species would fall, humans somehow find a way to keep standing. You're stubborn and adaptable and too foolish to know when you're beaten. Use that. Make the warrior work for every second. Make it respect the effort you put in. That's what truly means appropriate force. Show them that you understand the appropriate amount of effort required to survive." The advice had been surprisingly helpful and had carried it with him as he'd taken his position in the arena. Around them, the Thresh observers had begun a low, rhythmic clicking that resonated through the stone walls. It was their equivalent of a battle chant, had explained, a way of honoring both combatants. "Begin," Nor had called out, and the warrior priest had moved. Fast didn't begin to describe it. One moment the Thresh warrior had been 20 meters away, the next it was on, that bladed staff whistling through the air in an arc that would have taken his head off if he hadn't thrown himself sideways at the last possible second. He hit the ground hard, rolled, came up in a crouch just in time to see the second strike coming. Had dodged again, his body moving on pure instinct, every reflex honed through years of training screaming at him to move, move, move. The warrior priest's blade scored the ground where he'd been standing, leaving a gouge in the packed earth that smoked slightly. 3 heartbeats, 17 to go. The warrior had pressed the attack relentlessly, had given ground, circling, ducking, weaving, doing everything he could to keep distance between himself and those devastating blades. He'd noticed patterns in the attacks, rhythms that suggested trained techniques rather than wild aggression. The warrior priest was testing him, he realized, evaluating how he responded to different types of strikes. 6 heartbeats, 14 to go. His foot had caught on an uneven patch of ground, and he'd stumbled. The warrior priest had seized the opportunity, bringing the staff down in a vertical strike that would have split in half. Instead of trying to dodge, had done something the Thresh probably didn't expect. He'd stepped into the attack, inside the warrior's guard, his hands coming up to deflect the staff's shaft rather than the blades. The impact had nearly broken his arms. It felt like trying to stop a falling tree with bare hands. But the deflection had worked, sending the staff's trajectory off by just enough that the blade passed harmlessly by his head. He'd used the momentum to spin away, putting distance between them again. 10 heartbeats, 10 to go. Interesting, the warrior priest had said, its translator rendering the word with what might have been approval. The small human learns quickly. This one is impressed. But impressed didn't mean merciful. The warrior had changed tactics, using its 6 limbs to launch attacks from multiple angles simultaneously. Had found himself defending against strikes that came from directions he hadn't even known were possible. A blade had grazed his left arm, leaving a shallow cut that burned like fire. Another had passed close enough to his face that he'd felt the wind of its passage. 14 heartbeats, 6 to go. His lungs were burning, his muscles screaming, his vision starting to narrow from the combination of adrenaline and oxygen deprivation in the thin atmosphere. But he was still standing, still moving, still alive. He'd started to recognize the patterns in the warrior priest's attacks, to anticipate where the next strike would come from. He wasn't winning, but he was surviving, and right now that was enough. 17 heartbeats, 3 to go. The warrior priest had executed a spinning attack, all 6 limbs working in concert to create a whirlwind of blades that would have shredded anything caught in their path. Had dropped flat to the ground, feeling the air above him torn apart by the passing weapons. He'd rolled to the side, came up running, his legs pumping as he put distance between himself and the warrior. 19 heartbeats, 1 to go. The final attack had come faster than thought. The warrior priest had closed the distance in a single bound, the bladed staff coming around in a horizontal sweep that couldn't possibly dodge in time. He'd done the only thing he could think of. He'd jumped, straight up, using every ounce of strength in his legs to launch himself into the air. The blade had passed beneath his feet with millimeters to spare. Had come down hard, his ankle twisting painfully on the uneven ground, and he'd collapsed to one knee, his breath coming in ragged gasps. 20 heartbeats. The clicking from the Thresh observers had changed tone, becoming something that resonated deeper, that vibrated through his bones. The warrior priest had stepped back, lowering its weapon, its posture shifting from aggressive to neutral. This one acknowledges the humans, the warrior priest had said, and the words had carried a weight that felt even through the translator. 20 heartbeats have passed. The small human has proven worthy of knowledge. This one is honored to have tested such a determined spirit. Had tried to stand, had made it halfway up before his injured ankle had given out, and he'd collapsed back to the ground. Immediately had been there, the towering shriek lifting him as gently as if he weighed nothing. Had appeared beside them, all 6 eyes bright with something that might have been pride. Adequately done, specialist. The small alien had chittered, and had started laughing despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, because the idea of high praise was calling something adequate. Nor had approached them as the team had prepared to leave the arena. The Thresh leader had examined with those multifaceted eyes, its mandibles moving in patterns that the translator struggled to interpret. This one will explain what happened to the sleeping ones, Nor had said. Your diplomatic team came to learn our ways, to understand so that our peoples might cooperate. This one's people created a shared consciousness experience, allowing them to perceive reality as we do. But their minds were not prepared for the depth of connection. They became lost in the neural broadcast, unable to find their way back to individual consciousness. "Can they be restored?" had asked urgently. "Yes," Nor had confirmed, "but it will take time and careful guidance. This one's people will assist. Consider it a gesture of goodwill, acknowledgement that the small human has proven humanity possesses. Your species is stronger than we believed. Stubborn, adaptive, and unwilling to surrender even when victory is impossible. These are qualities we respect." The Thresh had been true to their word. Over the following weeks, they'd worked with coalition medical specialists to gradually restore consciousness to the diplomatic team members. The process had been slow and delicate, requiring a combination of neural therapy and traditional Thresh meditation techniques. But eventually, all 12 crew members had recovered with no permanent damage. The incident had become something of a legend within the coalition. The story of a human combat specialist volunteering for single combat against a Thresh warrior priest, surviving through sheer determination and adaptability, had spread throughout the fleet. Found himself recognized in corridors and mess halls, other species nodding with respect when they saw his face. But the biggest change had been in his relationship with. The small alien had stopped treating him as a student and started treating him as a partner. They'd developed a rhythm in combat training, anticipating each other's movements, covering each other's weaknesses, functioning as a unit rather than as separate individuals. 3 months after the Thresh incident, had been summoned to Captain's ready room again. This time had been present as well, all 6 eyes focused on with an intensity that made him nervous. "Specialist," the captain had begun, "Combat Specialist has made a request that I felt you should hear directly." Had stepped forward, and for the first time since had known the small alien, it had seemed uncertain. "In my species' culture," had begun, "there is a tradition called, or it roughly translates to blade bonding, a ceremony where 2 warriors declare themselves partners for life. They fight together, train together, and trust each other with their lives. It's the highest honor one Al can offer another." Had felt his heart rate pick up. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not Al. I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that." "You misunderstand," had chittered, and those 6 eyes had shown something had never seen before in them, vulnerability. "Or has never been offered to someone outside my species. It's never even been considered. But you've proven yourself not just in combat but in character. You charged a shadow creature to protect me. You volunteered for single combat to protect your team. You've shown me what it means to be part of something larger than individual strength." The small alien had produced 2 blades from its harness, each one beautifully crafted with handles designed for different hand configurations. "I wish to offer you, or Specialist, I wish to declare you my blade brother, my partner in all combat operations going forward. This is unprecedented in Al history, and some of my people will view it as controversial, but I believe it's right." Had taken the blade offered, feeling the perfect balance of the weapon in his hand. He'd looked down at the small alien who'd once mocked him mercilessly, who'd pushed him to his limits and beyond, who'd ultimately taught him what it meant to be a true warrior. "I accept," had said quietly. "It would be an honor to be your blade brother." The ceremony that followed had been simple but profound. In front of Captain and the assembled senior staff, and had performed a traditional Al blade dance, their movements synchronized despite their different physiologies. They'd drawn blood, mixing it on the blades as a symbol of their commitment to each other. And they'd sworn oaths, translated through their implants but carrying weight beyond words. When it was over and were no longer just teammates, they were partners, bound by tradition and mutual respect, committed to watching each other's backs for as long as they both lived. Lieutenant had been the first to congratulate them, her dark eyes sparkling with amusement. "You know this means you're stuck with each other now, right? I'll take their bonds seriously. You 2 are basically married in their culture." "I've heard worse fates," had replied, looking down at with genuine affection. "At least my partner knows how to fight. And at least mine knows when to charge stupidly into danger," had chittered back. The mockery returned but transformed into something warm, something that spoke of camaraderie rather than cruelty. The years that followed had proven the wisdom of their bond, and had become one of the most effective combat teams in the Coalition fleet, their different strengths and approaches complementing each other perfectly. They'd fought together through dozens of operations, saved hundreds of lives, and earned commendations from species throughout the galaxy. But more importantly, they'd proven something that many in the Coalition had doubted. That humans, despite being newcomers to galactic society, despite coming from a harsh that should have made them violent and unstable, could form bonds that transcended species boundaries. They could learn from other cultures while maintaining their own identity. They could adapt without losing themselves. 5 years after that first humiliating encounter in the training hall, stood beside on the bridge of the Valiant Dawn, watching as they approached a new mission. They were both combat specialists first class now, both decorated veterans with more combat experience than most Coalition soldiers accumulated in a lifetime. "Remember when you told me I flailed about with a stick like a juvenile?" had asked, grinning at his blade brother. His mandibles had spread in that familiar smile. "I remember. I also remember being wrong. You didn't flail like a juvenile. You flailed like a juvenile human, which is somehow both worse and more endearing." "You're terrible," had said, laughing. "And you're stubborn, reckless, and occasionally display tactical thinking so questionable that I wonder how your species survived to reach space," had countered. "But you're also brave, loyal, and adaptable enough to survive challenges that would kill most beings. You're human, and I wouldn't want any other species watching my back." As the Valiant Dawn entered the combat zone and had moved to their positions, their movements synchronized through years of training and an understanding that went beyond words. Whatever they faced next, they would face it together. Small alien warrior and stubborn human, blade brothers bound by honor and mutual respect, proving every day that the Coalition was stronger for including humanity in its ranks. And somewhere in the galaxy, other species watched and wondered if maybe, just maybe, those dangerous might be the best allies anyone could ask for. "Held the rank of Combat Specialist Second Class. Congratulations." The journey back to the ship had been quiet. Then had screamed,